looking particularly at this, the problems with Turkey, the problems with migrants, because, Martin, what we've had today is more and more worries by the British government about the whole idea of online grooming and radicalisation. Now, people are going to get radical if a government is corrupt, and they're not, by the word radicalisation, what they're saying is that people aren't trusting the system. Why won't they trust the system? They should.
Well, there's plenty of reason for people not to trust the system, but I would also make the point about online grooming.
Well, I'm talking about these 3 London girls from Syria that have gone to, apparently have gone off to Syria.
Well, and apparently one of them's been killed by a Russian airstrike, but, I mean, you know, we don't know whether that's true or not. But what is true is that previously a British young person, a woman, went to Syria having been groomed online, or went to Turkey having been groomed online. She was arrested in Turkey by the Turkish civilian police, and they also arrested the guy who'd been grooming her, who turned out to be a Canadian intelligence agent. So who's doing the grooming? Who is ISIS anyway? Because in actual fact, I'm quite sure, I mean, we know because they've said so, the Iraqi government, the Iranian government, the Russian government, the Syrian government are pretty much convinced that ISIS is a creation of Western intelligence services. And there's lots of evidence to suggest that is the case. Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra Front have just renamed themselves as something else, of Fatah al-Jash or something, and they are now fighting with the Syrian army in Aleppo. And Western media outlets like The Guardian are saying, these rebels we must support the rebels in Syria, blah, blah. This is Al-Qaeda Syria. So you've got senior politicians in the US saying that we've got to support Al-Qaeda in Aleppo against the Syrians and the Russians. Meanwhile, of course, we're also being told that we've had a war on terror going on for years and years. We're chasing around all over the planet to try and catch these people. But in the Syrian context, they're the good guys, and we better send the SAS in to give them a bit of a hand. It's nonsense. And of course the Syrian crisis has exposed that this wasn't just something that went on in the past and that we stopped doing. We're still doing it, and that's got to raise big questions about all of these attacks in France and Germany. They look very, very suspicious to me. They look suspiciously like false flag attacks orchestrated by NATO intelligence services. I'm pretty sure that's what the FSB and others will be concluding.
Well, it was actually the same case, Martin. The Daily Mail, an agent working for the Canadian intelligence has been arrested in Turkey under suspicion of helping 3 British schoolgirls travel to Syria to join the Islamic State. He was working for the Canadian intelligence services. They haven't named the guy. He's a spy, so they're not allowed to give his name.
What's beginning
This is on. We'll put this on our show page.
Yeah.
This is 12th of March 2015 in the Daily Mail.
Yeah. Well, the other thing that the Turkish police did is that they arrested a load of trucks going into Turkey which were packed with weapons for ISIS. They arrested the people driving them, and they turned out to work for MIT, the Turkish intelligence services. Now, instead of being allowed to put those people on trial, the police officers who'd carried out the raid have been put on trial by Erdogan as traitors, and journalists who've reported on the case have also been put on trial as traitors by Erdogan. But the evidence is overwhelming in my mind that virtually everything that's been going on in Syria has been orchestrated by NATO intelligence services in collaboration with Qatar and Saudi Arabia. So the whole creation of this armed uprising in Syria is to be laid at the door of the Western intelligence services, Martin, including all the people dead, all the people turned into refugees and all the rest of it.
Martin, let's bring this back home. Where is all this radicalisation going? If it looks as if, as in this case we've just seen with these 3 Syrian girls, that actually it's Western-allied, NATO-allied intelligence services that have been actually grooming these girls. I mean, let's just go through their names. I think we've got the names just here in front of me. It's Shamima Begum, Amira Abase, who are both 15, and Kadiza Sultana, who is 16 years old, groomed online by Canadian intelligence.
They're the same people. It was the same Canadian intelligence agent that groomed these girls.
Yeah.
Oh, right, I didn't realise that.
Yes, well, neither did I, but they weren't telling us that on the news.
No, they weren't.
That's this story, by the way. I put it, like I said, put a link to our show page. What about all all these accusations of online grooming and radicalisation? What if our own taxpayers' money, our own intelligence services are doing that grooming?
Well, it wouldn't surprise me in the slightest. That's exactly what we're suggesting is the case. And, of course, they then use what happens when these people get there as an excuse for further resources for the intelligence services to prevent radicalisation, even though they are themselves the radicalisers. The answer to this is independent police investigation. And as we've seen in Turkey, the police sometimes have the nous and the will to investigate these things properly.
As we've seen in the Tory election fraud, you can forget it, mate.
Well, the point about the police is that they're either on the level or they're not. If they are genuine,
that's a Masonic expression.
Well, okay.
You may be a Freudian slip there.
Touche, if that's the case. The fact is that ultimately we need everything investigated. We need all of the evidence out there, and people need to understand that a basic suspicion we have is that this is being orchestrated from inside the intelligence services. It may be that that's wrong, but it's a definite possibility, and it's a sort of thing the police need to bear in mind. We saw the British police, the West Midlands police, put somebody on trial at the Old Bailey not long ago, and they said he was going to go to Syria to fight for a particular group. His defence lawyers argued that the group itself was actually armed and trained by the British intelligence services, and the case was dropped. That should have been number one item on the news. It wasn't, when you're talking about the media. It was reported, and that's why we have proper trials with juries and all the rest of it, and instead of just administrative detention. It's not just because it's a fairness involved. It's also, if we don't have proper trials, it won't come out that the guy was actually he had been recruited. That guy had obviously been recruited by MI6 to go and fight in Syria. The police had arrested him and said, "Oh, you're going to go and fight in Syria." And he said, "Well, actually, I've been recruited by the British intelligence."
A lot of these people end up dead. There are no trials.
Well, indeed, that's right. And the point is that the purpose of all of this is to frighten the ordinary folk. As Vincenzo Vincingero, the fascist terrorist involved in Gladio in Italy, said, the whole point was to frighten the bejesus out of the ordinary folk so that they would give the government more power. And, of course, the more power you give the government, the more power they've got to do this sort of thing without proper oversight, without proper police control. And I think ultimately what we need is a rule of law. If somebody carries out a terrorist act, whoever they are, they should be caught and punished. And that includes top generals. And, of course, in Turkey, top generals have been sent to prison as terrorists. And that's what's got to happen in the end.
Getting bigger by being better. The number one choice for Bristol. This is BCFM 93.2.
Social worker Alexis J. She chaired the Rotherham Child Abuse Inquiry, which looked into the sexual abuse of 1,400 children between 1997 and 2013 in Rotherham. And her inquiry took place between 2014 and 2015. The only trouble is, Martin, with this new person that's just taking over the VIP paedophile inquiry, that no police or council officers, social workers, etc., will face any disciplinary action after that inquiry.
We're talking about
Rotherham, yeah. So, I mean, it does rather give the signal that maybe nobody is going to face any consequences with the paedophile inquiry.
Well, not least because in Rotherham what we're talking about is low-level abuse by people that were in positions to abuse those in their care.
Well, why do you say low-level?
Relatively, well, I don't mean low-level in terms of the abuse. I just mean that we're not talking about a political implication here. We're just talking about people getting away with stuff. Whereas the VI paedophile scandal, as we're going to come on to Dutroux later, obviously we've just been talking about the intelligence services engaging in terrorism. They also engage in child sex abuse as a means of blackmail. They do that as well. That's another one of their little tricks.
Looking at the Dutroux scandal, it's exactly 20 years ago tomorrow, in fact, that the first major arrests took place in that Dutroux scandal. In the afternoon of August the 13th, 1996, progress was finally made. A number of individuals were arrested on strong suspicions they'd been responsible for a wave of kidnappings of young girls in Brussels. Within days, these suspicions were backed up with solid evidence, but the arrest of Dutroux and some of his associates turned out to be only the beginning of the biggest scandal in Belgian history. Media attention had begun in June 1995 with the disappearance of two 8-year-old girls, Julie Lejeune and Melissa Rousseau. Almost exactly 2 months later, the 17-year-old Anne Marshall, 19-year-old F.G. Lambrechts went missing. Additional media attention was drawn to the latter case, as the last thing these girls did was visit the show of Rasti Rosteli, a prominent magician, in which they had been hypnotised. Needless to say, the affair ended the career of the magician, even though he had almost immediately been cleared as a suspect. In late 1995, the Belgian FBI, branch of the gendarmerie, largely ceased to investigate the case. However, the disappearance of Anne and FG remained prominent because a foundation named Mark and Corinne, set up several years earlier and named after two teenagers who'd been brutally murdered, used its limited funds to spread posters of the girls' faces all over Belgium and the Netherlands. In the end, this made no difference. The girls weren't found. nor those responsible. And in May 1996, history repeated itself. This time, 12-year-old Sabine Dardenne disappeared, and again, Bob was unable to find, this is B.O.B., unable to find the kidnappers or the girl. People became more worried for their children with every kidnapping. Confidence in the police and judiciary, traditionally already quite low, began sinking to new depths. Now, Martin, this was really the beginning phase of this scandal, which rolled on for years and ended up with a massive public demonstration with hundreds of thousands of people in the centre of Brussels.
Yeah, well, the main take-home here is that the True was being protected because he was involved with the intelligence services, who were using child sex abuse as a means of blackmail on senior politicians, etc. And I suspect that is what we're looking at in Britain too, just as we're looking at the intelligence services engagement in Islamist terrorism and other kinds of terrorism over many years. People who are going to go around blowing things up and then trying to blame it on other people aren't going to balk at using children as pawns in their game to try and blackmail people. And so we got the Kincora Boys Home in Northern Ireland. All the evidence seems to suggest that MI5 were using the boys in the home as honey traps to blackmail loyalist paramilitaries. And of course that's possibly what's been going on in other children's homes across the UK.
Martin, the Detrue scandal took place in the city which is the headquarters for NATO and the European Union.
Indeed, that's right. But I think the NATO angle on all of this is the most important one. Of course, it was also in Belgium that you had the supermarket massacres, the so-called Brabant massacres in the 1980s, where people just turned up in sort of Halloween masks and started massacring people at random in supermarkets without taking any of the takings or anything to do with them. And there was an article by Hugh O'Shaughnessy in The Observer about this, and it was actually probably what he was concluding was this was actually US Marines who were doing this, who've been parachuted in from Britain, and that nobody's ever been caught for any of it. But of course in Italy the police have investigated, as I mentioned earlier, Imposimata, the head of the Italian Supreme Court, has investigated many of these cases.
Okay, in Belgium there was used to be a great programme on the BBC, how many times have I said that, called Correspondent, and Olenka Frankel back in May 2002 did an investigation into this, and you can watch it online about the Detrue scandal. It's called Belgium's X-Files, an Olenka Frankel investigation, a case of abduction and murder against Belgium's infamous paedophile Marc Detrue. But Martin, at the end of the day, there were political reasons behind Detrue and how he was protected. I mean, what lessons are there to learn about our own VI paedophile scandal?
Well, I think, first of all, people have got to understand, as we've been saying earlier, that the intelligence services do engage in terrorism, and B, they've got to understand that they do encourage child sex abuse as a tool of their trade. And once people have got that into their heads, then we can have an independent investigation of all these things and try and get to the bottom of what's really been going on. But the idea that they don't do such things is simply wrong. They do. The evidence is overwhelming.
This is a bit worrying, I think, Alexis J being appointed to take over the VI paedophile scandal. Not only have they had all these different chairs, which is rather chaotic, not only have they also got a whole load of people from the Home Office staffing this investigation, where the Home Office itself is under suspicion as part of the investigation. Looking at her track record in Rotherham is not good. I mean, looking at, for example, this statement after that no police or council officer is going to face any disciplinary action, although it was the police and council officers who were charged with looking after these 1,400 children, and evidence was presented to those social workers, to those police, that the abuse was going on, and nothing was done. And, virtually nothing anyway. The only scalp after Rotherham, after 6 years of abuse, sexual abuse, was that the Police and Crime Commissioner Sean Wright resigned.
Well, it's not good enough, is it? As we know. But I think that unfortunately child sex abuse is a feature of our society that needs to be confronted. But of course the VIP child sex abuse has got political implications. It's not just bad behaviour. It's bad behaviour which is being manipulated by puppet masters behind the scenes.
Also, another thing to say about Alexis J is that she has, she's after the end of the Rotherham inquiry, accused the Labour-dominated council of turning a blind eye to the problem because of their desire to accommodate a community that would be expected to vote Labour.
That may or may not be so, but certainly that could be an issue in Rotherham. I think the real problem in Rotherham is that the girls who were being abused were, most of them, from care, and basically there's a lot of young people in this country whose lives simply don't matter. And they're just thrown on the scrap heap even before they become teenagers.
There's something about this that stinks to me, in that it's like, well, these Muslims might vote Labour, so it's the Muslims and Labour Party's fault that it happened in the first place, the abuse of...
Well, it may well be that the whole Rotherham thing has been brought out to undermine the VIP paedophile inquiry, because then it becomes a question of the Labour Party and Muslims covering up for each other, rather than the Kincora Boys' Home, where the finger is pointed firmly at MI5.
What about also the fact that there's many survivors of child sexual abuse out there that may think twice about giving evidence to an inquiry that is in such a mess?
Well, that may well be the case, Tony. I mean, the fact is that we've got to try and educate people to understand what goes on behind the scenes. And we're not just talking about, turning a blind eye to sex abuse in local authorities. The people who run the intelligence services, who work very closely with the oligarchy that really runs the society, have been engaging in criminal behaviour for years. You mentioned the Franklin scandal earlier. Perhaps you'd like to tell the audience a bit more about the Franklin scandal, because of similar things were going on in the United States. There's a pattern here, isn't there? There's a pattern here of NATO intelligence services using child abuse as a means of social control.
OK, well, we're talking about Dutroux particularly, but this article, I would put a link on our show page too, which is really quite detailed. It's by Joel van der Rijden. I'm not sure if I pronounced that, it's a Dutch name, from something called the Institute for the Study of Globalisation and Covert Politics, website isgp-studies.com. And it's a fascinating story as to how this actually came out. It's amazing. It's just like some kind of copper on the beat discovered something that the higher-ups in the police had been ignoring for years. He said that the BOB, which is this... Belgian FBI adjutant Jean-Pierre Peters reported a breakthrough in the investigation of the several dozen tips. 2 turned out to be useful. 2 witnesses had seen an old white van driving around Bertrix the day Lalisha disappeared. In one of these 2 cases, a student was afraid the driver of the van was planning to steal his bike. As luck would have it, the 22-year-old had a passion for cars and reported to the police the exact type of van and a good chunk of its licence plate, as the first 3 letters reminded him of the name of his sister. In no time, Dutroux's name, a known paedophile, came out of the computer. A crisis meeting was held in Bertrix that evening, and the following day, Dutroux, his wife Michelle Martin and his sidekick Michel Lelevre were arrested. In the following days, their testimonies led to the retrieval of 2 girls, Sabine and Alicia, in Dutroux's basements. Belgium's case of the century was about to begin. Now, amazing, isn't it, how just a little sighting like that, a little report to a police officer could lead to a massive scandal like that being unwound, beginning of it being unwound.
Well, that's the way. See, all criminal behaviour ultimately involves taking the risk that somebody is going to find out what you're doing just by accident, if nothing else. And the question is that Dutroux was protected for years because I believe that he was probably providing victims to senior politicians and others, and that's why he was being covered. OK, well,
there's another aspect to all this which I came across in the last 10 days or so, which is this US MK Ultra. Before we hear the clip from this documentary about MK Ultra in the United States, Martin, which was a CIA programme, mind control program, some call it. You might call it a kind of torture preparation program, but it was the idea being that drugs and all sorts of other things were administered on people against their will without them realising that somehow this could be linked with the NATO intelligence services.
Well, that's precisely what we've been saying and reiterating again and again. They've got a track record of doing this kind of stuff. The question is, are they doing it now? And the answer is probably going to be yes, isn't it?
Let's have a listen now to an extract from this documentary by Paul Altmaier, who was on did a program in 1979 called ABC Close Up about the MK Ultra mind control program.
A decision was made at the highest levels of the CIA to do testing on unwitting Americans. As one CIA document says, such testing would be operationally realistic. A former CIA official who worked on these programs describes for the first time how the decision was made. He did not wish to be filmed or recorded. Thus his remarks are read by someone else.
I think every last one of us felt sorry to attempt this kind of thing. We knew we were crossing the line. Every decent kid knows he shouldn't steal, but he does it sometimes. We knew damn well we didn't want anyone else to know what we were doing.
The decision was made to do testing on unwitting victims. It was decided they should be on the fringes of society because they were most vulnerable.
It was the borderline underworld, prostitutes, drug addicts, and other small-timers who would be powerless to seek any kind of revenge in case they found out.
And as their predecessors had a decade earlier, the CIA turned to George White for help. White was now a high-ranking narcotics official, and by this time the stories about George White were legendary.
So the waiter says, "You may I help you, monsieur?" And George White was busy talking with me. I paid no attention to the waiter, so the waiter tapped him on the shoulder, says, "May I help you, monsieur?" George White turned around, whipped his gun out, and stuck it in the guy's face like this in this crowded restaurant.
George White did not mind bending the law, and he knew the street well. He was the ideal choice for what the CIA had in mind.
We were Ivy League, white, middle class. We were naive, totally naive about this, and he felt pretty expert. He knew the whores, the pimps, the people who brought in the drugs.
White set up so-called safe houses for the CIA in New York, here in Greenwich Village, and later in San Francisco, in this hotel, and in an apartment atop Telegraph Hill with a commanding view of San Francisco Bay. While the existence of these safe houses was disclosed last year, details of what took place within them has not been told. A former CIA official who worked in the safe houses reveals that they were used not only for drug testing, but to study sexual behavior and how it could be used to manipulate people.
We did quite a study of prostitutes and their behavior. How do you take a woman who is willing to use her body to get money out of a guy to get him to talk about things which are much more important, like state secrets? We learned a lot about human nature in the bedroom. We started to pick up knowledge that could be used in operations.
There would be victims in all of this, but as the agency knew, they couldn't fight back. Some entries from George White's diaries. Clarice gets horrors. Janet, sky high. As one agency memo says, we have no answer to the moral question. The safe houses were not the only testing grounds. Millions of dollars would be spent on LSD research at universities throughout the country. And word would begin to spread on campus about this so-called mind-blowing drug. And suddenly, there was the counterculture of the 60s.
I give the CIA a total credit for sponsoring and initiating the entire consciousness movement, counterculture events of the 1960s.
Dr. Timothy Leary, the 1960s Johnny Appleseed of LSD.
The CIA funded and supported and encouraged hundreds of young psychiatrists to experiment with this drug. The fallout from that was that the young psychologists began taking it themselves, discovering that it was an intelligence-enhancing, consciousness-raising experience.
I know that some of the studies in which the CIA had supported used as subjects people who later became strong proselytizers of LSD. So, in that sense, yes, I think it did sustain the perpetuation of the use of the drug. And it's rather ironic, isn't it?
The counter case that I would make in relationship to that is to remember that the people who were doing the research were people who would be doing the research regardless of who was the sponsor. I don't think anybody working in that time in the remotest ever thought that it would blow up into the kind of thing that it did.
History will judge the role of the CIA and other intelligence agencies in unwittingly contributing to the counterculture of the 60s through their intense interest in LSD and other hallucinogenics. But for the moment at least, the argument can be made that the CIA helped usher in the age of Aquarius.
Well, Martin, that was an extract from a documentary called MK Ultra Mind Control on the part of the ABC in US television's Close-Up series in 1979 by Paul Altmaier. But it really does talk about the idea of the intelligence services seeing themselves as able to, with impunity, conduct human experimentation with drugs and sexuality.
Well, if they're going to carry out false flag terrorism and child sex abuse, then I'm afraid that sort of thing is going to be par for the course, isn't it? It's the end justifies the means argument, that we are above the law and our goals are so great and wonderful that we don't have to obey the rules like everybody else. But at the same time, of course, we push the idea that we're a society based on rules and rule of law, unlike those evil communists, jihadists, pencil in your own enemy.
And the people who are being experimented on couldn't fight back, he says.
Well, no, and nor can people suffering from child sex abuse or people caught up in false flag terrorist attacks. When the bomb goes off, it blows your head off.
What about this whole idea, though, of the victim, unwitting victims? So it's almost like an extension of the kind of Mengele kind of, the idea that we just see people almost as animals to experiment on.
Well, it's interesting you should mention that, because on other shows we've covered the recruitment of Nazi personnel, particularly intelligence personnel, by NATO as it was being created. And many of the techniques for psychological warfare, which were pioneered in Nazi Germany, have been integrated into Western intelligence practice, and that's because there's a continuity there, and it's not just copycat. It's actually because they're linked.
Well, we've mentioned Colonia Dignidad on this programme before, which is the Nazi experimentation camp that carried on after the war up in the Chilean Alps. And many people would say, in fact, some of the people who were researching on it and the victims there at the time, that this was they were doing exactly the same kind of stuff in there, doing experimenting on humans, so that they could develop torture techniques, this kind of thing.
That's right, and it was all under the aegis of the CIA in Latin America, leading up to the coup in 1973 and then the disappearance of thousands and thousands of left-wing activists by the Pinochet regime. Even worse in Argentina, Paraguay, etc. And I think that, with all these years later now, we've got overwhelming evidence that this is what was going on. Why do we presume that it's not going on today? Nobody was ever really punished for any of this, so we've got to presume that they're still doing it.
Okay, so what's the purpose of it all?
It's about control, isn't it? Why do people want to control things? Because they're wealthy, they're powerful, they're the ones that matter, and the rest of us are simply in the way.
But it does imply that there is really no rule of law, that if people can get away with this kind of thing, they do need to have state agencies. I mean, we're talking about police, National Crime Agency, these kinds of people, part of the cover-up before these crimes are even committed.
Yeah, but at the same time, one of the ideological beliefs in the society is that there is a rule of law. So we don't have a complete law of the jungle. If you or I were to engage in any of these activities, or, God forbid, to decide that we were going to enter into an armed opposition to the government, we would quite rightly be regarded as dangerous maniacs and locked up. They, on the other hand, hide behind the facade of the law, but are in fact the real criminals. And that's not just rhetoric. They are criminals, and that's why they're vulnerable. Just to
bring this back to today, really, the US military manipulated intelligence to downplay the threat of ISIS, we hear this week. Middle East Eye, US military leaders painted an overtly optimistic picture of American efforts to fight the Islamic State group in Iraq and Syria, according to a government report released on Thursday this week. This is the finger pointing, actually, Martin, at something called CENTCOM, which we don't hear anywhere near enough about. CENTCOM disseminated news releases and made public statements that were significantly more positive than reality. So they allowed ISIS to thrive, effectively. Who are CENTCOM?
It's, you may not realise it, but the US have got a command that controls everything about. So CENTCOM covers the Middle East, AFRICOM covers Africa, although many African countries don't accept it, and you've got other they basically have got full spectrum dominance, and they're trying to get full spectrum dominance. You've got hundreds of US military bases all over the world. There's only a minority of countries that don't have one. Why does the US need to have bases everywhere? Because they want to control the global environment. and the people behind them want to control the global environment. The problem is that there are countries like Russia, China and Iran that don't want to be controlled. And it's very dangerous because this could lead, and already has led, to war.
Getting bigger by being better. The number one choice for Bristol. This is BCFM 93.2.
We're going to have a listen now to Susan Lindauer. Martin, many people asking a similar question that she's asking here, which is about the peace dividend. People want a peace dividend after the end of the Cold War. They're not getting it, even after the end of the Iraq War.
Well, indeed, because in actual fact, peace is not going to be allowed. That's not on the agenda.
I set out to guarantee, and I can promise you we succeeded in spades, to guarantee that there would be a peace dividend that would generate huge profits for shareholders. It would create jobs. It would create billions of dollars in positive revenue that, without having to kill people is what I mean. Positive revenue that would be, building a society, rebuilding Iraq's water systems, rebuilding sanitation, rebuilding the hospitals so that the Middle East would be stronger, healthier, more vibrant, functioning, and that there would be a good bridge between the West and the East. And when they started pushing for the war, I was like, are you crazy? Iran is going to be the great victor in this. That was one of the big messages that I kept pushing, was that Iran would be the victor. I'll tell you a tragedy on a parallel tragedy on my side of the pond. While I was locked up in prison on Carswell Air Force Base on the Patriot Act, I was accused of, quote, being, quote, not competent to stand trial. They made up a story that I was a religious maniac. I do believe in God. Indisputably, I refuse to disavow my faith in God. God gives me strength. God gives me a moral compass. Those values have carried me through. You want to call it a crutch? Anybody who's an atheist, you go ahead. It is a crutch, and it's a crutch that keeps me walking. And it keeps my heart strong, and it keeps me positive in my vision of what I want for this world to be. So, okay, it is a crutch, fine, but it's still there. And I was accused of being incompetent because I believe in God. They actually dared to accuse me of that. And it's why I have a special contempt for Tony Blair and George Bush and Dick Cheney and Hillary Clinton and all of those politicians who now recognize the war in Iraq was a catastrophe, but who continue to blame the intelligence community.
Susan Lindauer there, she's the negotiator in Iraq, and she was a negotiator for the CIA in Libya too. But Martin, she's being told, basically they're drumming up any excuse they can to just stick her in jail.
Yeah, but she's managed to get out of jail, and she's now, speaking, telling the truth about what was really going on behind the scenes. And
she's got a radio show over in the States every weekend, in fact.
Yeah. And the problem for the people behind all of the evil things we've been covering in the second hour of the show today is that, given modern technology and information technology, none of this is going to go away. It's going to carry on being broadcast on shows like this, being circulated on the internet, and ultimately they can't hide. There's nowhere to hide.
But it does seem to me, though, that we do now have a criminal elite, basically a bunch of people who are protecting each other, who are looking at anybody that's telling the truth, being honest, looking after the public, who's in public service, who's in government, who's in the military, as a potential problem.
Yep, and it's a very dangerous situation, but as you pointed out, they are criminals, and therefore they are prosecutable. They're not just the lines of inquiry will lead directly back to the people at the top if they're pursued properly. They've got a whole
load of lines of defences, haven't they? They've got the chief constables who may not pursue a prosecution if there's pressure put on them. Then they've also got things like the Crown Prosecution Service. Then they've got the judiciary, which many point to as being quite corrupt.
That's true, but nevertheless, they are banged to rights on all of it, and ultimately, therefore, prosecutable, and therefore you're not just talking about voting them out of office, we're talking about locking them up for a very, very long time.
Well, yes.
And of course, what's going to happen in Turkey with people supporting the coup there, they're going to end up dead, because they're going to bring back the death penalty and execute
When
them.
James Files killed President Kennedy, assassinated him for the mafia and the CIA, effectively, back in 1963, it's taken over 50 years. In fact, it's just pretty much 50 years on that anyone actually knew that he did it. I mean, if it's going to take 50 years for the prosecution to catch up with someone, then they're going to go and do the crime, aren't they?
Yeah, but the thing is, it's getting faster and faster, and we've got all of this history of bad behaviour now. It's not as if they just started doing this bad behaviour after 9/11, which was probably an inside job anyway. We've got bad behaviour going back decades, and it's the same people involved in the Iran-Contra affair, all turned up in the Bush administration. They're all going to turn up in the Clinton administration if Clinton wins the election. The fact of the matter is, we know who these people are. We know who they are. The police, if they're independent, will know who they are. The intelligence services of so-called enemy countries know who they are. It's astonishing. They haven't got any. It's the same old people. The Elliot Abrahams, the Colonel Oliver Norths, and all the rest of it. They're still there. But that means that they're get-atable, because we've got a massive track record of bad behaviour. So we're not just going to accuse them of what they've been done recently. We've got all this evidence that goes back decades.
Thanks, Martin. Well, it's time to sign off now for the Murdoch News at 7 o'clock. Mohammed Makawi's out in Sudan for a few weeks. Thanks to our guest in the first hour, even though he only managed to make 5 minutes. That's leader of the Lib Dem group and councillor for Knoll, Gary Hopkins. Thanks also to Martin Summers there. Our sister show Dialect is on BCFM at noon every Tuesday, and this week, .org.uk takes you straight to this show, our links and archives, the show page where you can download our MP3s to your heart's content, listen in the car or anywhere. I'm on Twitter at Tony Gosling, wishing you a relaxing and enjoyable weekend. Do please join us for the Politics Show at 5 o'clock next week, where we'll do some Aldous Huxley. And don't let the banksters get you down.
From the Sky News Centre.